Fictional works that rely heavily on historical context often need another level of world building and character development techniques in order to create an authentic reflection of the time period being presented. Often, this can be achieved by speaking in the mother tongue of that particular geographical setting the characters find themselves in. The linguistic technique of vernacular dialect allows the author to immerse their reader into the time and place of a story, as well as deepen character through dialogue, effectively enhancing the realism of a fictional work. The Book Thief, by Markus Zusak, tells the incredible story of young Liesel Memminger, who grows up in Nazi Germany amongst the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust. Zusak is a German-Australian writer who draws on his heritage and personal family stories as inspiration for this novel. To further capture the attention of his readers, he employs foreign language and dialect. Essentially, vernacular, according to the Oxford Living Dictionary, is the language or dialect of an ordinary group of people from a particular country or region. It is often used informally, meaning it incorporates slang or idioms from that particular culture. In the case of the Book Thief, the vernacular German of people living under the Nazi regime allows Markus Zusak to build an authenticity in his characters and the world they live in. This stylistic technique is most prominent, but not limited to, dialogue, which allows the reader to see exactly how a character speaks. Zusak evidently does this through Rosa Huberman, whose consistent use of German swears such as Saumensch or Zakrel provide the reader with a deeper understanding of who she is as a character. There are many examples of this in the text, but here's one I've chosen. That Zakrel, that filthy pig, you call him Papa. First test? Understand? This provides insight into Rosa's tempered personality, but these terms also become endearing towards people she loves. However, that is revealed through her tone more than through dialect. Dialogue often has this effect and plays an important role in characterization. Therefore, Zusak is highlighting a character's social status and emotional capacity through the vernacular, creating an additional dynamic to the dialogue. He goes even further by making the reader familiar with Rosa's swearing in German, by explaining the translations and pronunciations through narration. Every second word was either Saumensch or Zakrel or Arschloch. For people who aren't familiar with these words, I should explain. Sau, of course, refers to pigs. In the case of Saumensch, it serves to castigate, berate, or plain humiliate a female. Zakrel, pronounced Zakrel, is for a male. Arschloch can be translated directly into asshole. Additionally, Markus Zusak situates his characters within Nazi Germany through his use of vernacular dialect. This technique effectively creates a genuine atmosphere for the setting. The use of German words and their syntax within the prose also aids in creating a historical backdrop within the fictional story. Zusak predominantly does this within the novel's narration. Between the real German towns of Munich and Dachau lies the fictitious town called Mulching, said best by you and me as Mulking, as quoted from the text. Here, Zusak places his imagined wartime story in the accurate geographical location, which aligns his historical events of the Holocaust, specifically the concentration camp in Dachau. This example further establishes the setting as well as reminds the reader that all the characters speak the vernacular language of German and not English. He said something they could obviously not understand. He spoke in English. He said thank you. What? Rudy asked him. Was hat du gesagt? What did he say? Another method Zusak employs in his novel to enhance the historical backdrop of Nazi Germany is his incorporation of historical events, or at least an accurate fictional interpretation. He includes events of Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, Adolf Hitler's birthday book burnings, air raid bombings, and Jewish parades. These events are all reported accurately throughout the Book Thief. Thus, Zusak's use of German dialect within these scenes becomes significant of the world he's illustrating to the reader. Here is an excerpt from the book Burning Scene within the novel. This excellently demonstrates how a few sprinkled foreign words can add to the overall effect of the mayor's patriotic speech, reflective of the German propaganda at the time. Words such as Kommunisten and Juden can be easily interpreted as communist and Jew, because these words are reminiscent of the time period Zusak has already established within the novel. The German words above also frequent the novel as opposed to their English counterparts, again prompting the reader they are in Germany. However, the German word Schreischiri is more unfamiliar, therefore needs an explanation. To use vernacular dialect effectively, it requires the author to retain readability of the text through translations. Otherwise, the reader will become disinterested or lose the impact behind the vernacular stylistic choice. This stylistic technique can vary in its execution, so here are 4 different instances we see in the Book Thief where Zusak has translated sections of text to increase its readability. We see in these examples that sometimes the simplest way to use dialect is a direct translation of the foreign word. Zusak does this by literally signposting it for the reader through bolded excerpts such as Himmel for heaven, or a slightly trickier word, Bürgermeister, which is mayor in English. These German words are used often within the text, so by translating them, this way the reader has a clear understanding of the vernacular. However, in these examples, Zusak includes the English translation directly after the German within the dialogue spoken. By doing this, the reader never loses track of what's being said. Here, Markus Zusak uses definitions of the vernacular German to increase the significance of a scene within the novel. Zusak has again used bolded titles in these excerpts to impress upon the reader the importance of these words within the story. Also, make note of the second example here, where the narrator has also provided a pronunciation of the word being defined. This can also add an interesting dynamic to this technique. Lastly, Zusak makes no effort in these excerpts to offer the reader a translation of the text, but rather just hangs the German words in the air, allowing the reader to interpret what has been said. This only becomes effective when the author provides enough context for the reader to make sense of it, but does also successfully emphasize that the characters are speaking another language. A further thing to note is Zusak's use of italics for the German words that are in a paragraph of narration. See here, Rosa Huberman was always talking, and when she was talking, she was schmeifen. This draws attention to the foreign word, which in many cases would be the author's intention, but also helps the reader recognize that this word is different and gives them time to process it. Leslie Tenero, Filipino-American short story writer whose work also includes vernacular dialect, suggests, "I believe italics can be useful and at times necessary. If readers are willing to invest their precious time into reading your work, it may help them to know that a particular word is a non-English language, so that they're not stumbling or rereading to make sure they haven't tripped up. That can pull readers out of the narrative too." It is important to use foreign dialect in moderation so as not to annoy your reader, because once you start writing long paragraphs of text in the vernacular, you will lose their attention and the meaning behind the foreign language will become lost. Rather, it is better to season your prose with dialect, giving them enough flavour, but not so much that it becomes intrusive or overpowering for your reader. Consistency is also a fundamental element to vernacular words or phrases used throughout the novel. Zusak, whose characters are all German-speaking, therefore, the sprinkling of the vernacular throughout the prose creates a genuine historical backdrop. This will look different if you attempt to tackle multiple vernacular dialects or just one character that speaks a foreign language in order to make them more organic. Here is an example of my own work, telling the story of a young girl who is walking the Camino by herself and the people she meets along the way. This piece is not historical fiction, but for the purposes of this assignment, I focused on vernacular dialect, much like Zusak includes in his novel. In this first example, I have used the Spanish word for hostel, which is albergue. I didn't offer a direct translation for this word because within context, the reader can assume that the character is sleeping in communal accommodation. I italicized the foreign words as well, like Tenaru suggests, so that the reader recognizes that albergue is in a different vernacular than the rest of the prose. I have also mentioned real Spanish towns such as Grado, which helps build my setting. To further establish this, I would write visual and sensory image to bring more depth to the landscape of the Primitivo Trail. Where I'm writing about the Camino de Santiago, I include a direct translation of the Spanish and also a definition in Zusak style to create a greater impact of the vernacular dialect. Following on from this, I use Zuzak's signposting technique again for another translation of Primitivo. This example of dialogue, spoken by Maria, where she quotes something in her vernacular dialect and then translates it straight away in the second half of the sentence. This establishes that Sarah is an Italian and needs the phrase interpreted to make sense of it. Later in this piece, I use the vernacular to characterize Maria further by showing that her English isn't fluent and that she struggles to find the words to speak to Sarah. Lastly, I attempted to provide a phonetic pronunciation of the phrase Dio t'aiuta to make it clear for the reader to understand. Some final tips I discovered through my experience of writing this piece is writing dialect and vernacular language works best when the author has some experience with the language they are writing. I very loosely based this piece on similar experiences and conversations in my own travels of the El Camino. I felt like this helped me bring more realism to the vernacular I've used, even though I speak no Spanish or Italian. Researching the language you are writing your dialect in is also an important part of using vernacular words and phrases, as you want it to look as authentic as you possibly can, so that it doesn't look out of place or cause offense to that particular culture. I encourage you to give this technique a go because it does help to create more realistic and diverse characters and settings within your writing, especially if you are writing a story or scene set wholly in another country. This technique may present a challenge to some readers because it does require the extra level of effort, but as Zusak quotes here, I think that's when your true audience starts to love a book the most, when you trust them enough to come with you anyway. Thank you for listening to my presentation on vernacular dialect in historical fiction and how this technique is employed by Markus Zusak in The Book Thief.